research that we saw today was particularly interesting because it showed us that MEPs and Brussels decision makers are basically, like everyone else, beginning to use the web and social media in their everyday life. And the 70% of Facebook users amongst MEPs, and I think 82 amongst decision makers, really showed us that these things are becoming part of their normality, what I call the new normal, what actually Peter Hinson described in his book as the new normal. With that new reality, their habits are changing. The way they look for information and they share information is changing. So whether or not they use it as a core communication campaign doesn't really matter. What's really interesting is that they're beginning to use it just as anyone else, and by doing that, they're opening up to the possibility of using social media in every kind of campaign. The question about whether social media will be a big factor in the up and coming European elections, I think that it will be important, it will be part of everyone's campaign, and that will be a big change. But the problem with Europe and with Brussels in particular is much deeper than simply whether or not you use a new channel. You need to rethink the fundamentals of the European project and how you're going to engage with citizens. I think social media, Facebook, Twitter, etc., are putting increasing pressure on the institutions to react differently and to listen, but I think we haven't seen a huge amount of listening happening yet because of the resistance and because of what I call the frozen paradigms of Brussels. It's much easier not to change than to change. It's much easier not to engage, or at least to engage cosmetically, than to engage fundamentally. So my feeling is that until they've made a real paradigm shift in how they perceive the European project and their role as communicators and as innovators, you're going to see the same messages transmitted through new channels, and unfortunately, given the crisis we're facing, I don't think that will be enough. When you're in a large organization or institution like the Commission, Parliament, Council, it can look very daunting, and it can look like there are some structural things that you cannot change. I think what we've seen with the example of Ian and the interpretation Facebook page, with Aurélie and the work she did at Eurocontrol, and even the page of the European Parliament, what we see is that these tools are useful. They can really help on specific situations, but they can also help to really change the organization. And I think that's what we're seeing when we hear from individuals like Ian, that they're using this to find people that they need to staff their teams, to learn new languages. So I think that individuals, through social networks and through these new channels, can have more power. And the more individuals take the initiative, the more you're going to see these things changing their large institutions. So my message to people who work in these environments is, don't be daunted by the constraints that you might perceive. Shift your perception and try to experiment. As somebody mentioned in today's discussion, you can prototype, you can experiment, and these small experiments can actually sometimes yield disproportionate amounts of benefits. So as you experiment, you might start moving the needle. So I think there is hope that individuals, and there are a large number of very bright individuals in Brussels, but that are constrained within an environment that generally doesn't allow them to successfully try these new things, but some of them do. Therefore, it's possible, and I think we need to really encourage people to try different things, to challenge preconceptions. But I think there's a deeper political problem that can only be solved at a leadership level, which is, where is Europe heading, and are people prepared to recognize that there's some problems that need new thinking or hyperthinking. Yesterday, actually, I was at a conference for an NGO, for a group of NGOs, actually, and they reminded me a lot of what we hear in the association and corporate setting. In fact, an NGO is a network of people who have a common cause, who come together. They have been the ones breaking the mold, especially when they had financial challenges and they couldn't get funding, so they were actually forced to go out and really make a difference and impress. And I think it's really a case of these constraints driving innovation, not a deliberate strategy, but actually a necessity. So I think NGOs Also, being the pioneer doesn't mean it comes easily. They need to do the mind shift that we talked about today. They need to learn to hyperthink and to use new models and to get their team to be more comfortable with technology, to be more comfortable with networking. So I think that there's work to be done. And the thing about, the traditional view that NGOs are fighting with industry, I think is a bit of a myth, because the reality is that when NGOs engage in conversation with industry, it brings everyone into a conversation. And the tools force people to be more thoughtful, more engaged. But I think it helps the industry step back and say, well, maybe we could do things better. Maybe we could be more transparent. So I think a lot of what NGOs are doing are forcing industries to change and adapt, but NGOs are also adapting and changing themselves. But I think overall it's a very good situation, and we live at a very interesting time.